Check, 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 check. This is John Immel looking really funny with the headset on. Be back in a minute. Wow, what a day in some. Got to do my weatherman thing again. See the 3? Right there. Now you can see my tank shirt, right? John? No, that says tank. That says John. It's reversed in the camera. Is this thing on? I don't know how the weather guys do it. There it is. Day 2. Check 1, 2, 3, 4. I think I'm running. I think. Could be. Do I have everything? I don't think that's framed right because I need to show them tank. Okay, so made some adjustments. Is this a better? I think I've got this right. Sound should be pretty good. Always doesn't hit the mic. That's a bad idea. Check 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, pretty good. Beautiful, clean, crisp sound. That is the motor on my powered desk. It is way cool. When you're recording, shut off all electronic devices. And just so you know, the people that have the Ring doorbell, when it says it only rings at 5 feet, that's not true. I've got that doorbell set threshold at 5 feet. It easily picks up stuff on the street. That's a bad thing. Okay, I gotta confess, this mountain time to East Coast time thing is really messing with me. And Paul's like, what are you talking about? I've been up for 55 million hours straight. Sorry, I need to reposition my mic here. It's early for me, but it's been early for them back there, so. Anyway, I have not said hello to anybody at Tank yet. So my apologies. I just realized I'm like, oh my gosh, I've not said hello. Hey, Susan. Hey, Paul. Hey, Andy. Hey, I'm pretty sure Barb's there. Hey, Barb. So I have threatened now to read Bible verses and all kinds of things. And people are like, oh my God, he's going to actually read a Bible verse. Will he go up and smoke? No, I won't. I did, actually, a couple years ago, I did read a Bible verse, and I did not, the Bible didn't burn in my hands, and I didn't, immediately catch fire, so I think we'll be all right. I do want to demonstrate the methodologies that I've been talking about. And of course, I've thrown down the gauntlet on the whole business of the fall of man, which is fine. I wanted to do that. That was actually one of the primary things that I wanted to challenge. But now I want to illustrate some of the methodologies that I think will help unravel what is actually in Genesis, not the standard historic Reformed theology interpretation, which I think is largely superimposed. And I think by the end of this session, you'll see what I mean. Oh, by the way, question: How did you like the outtakes? That's the stuff I had to edit out because I was like, oh my God, that's ridiculous. But some of it's funny, and some of it's just ridiculous, but I hope you liked it. But the scope of this issue of me demonstrating these things is actually huge. I should probably show you how huge. This could easily turn into a doctoral dissertation, particularly if I wanted to take on some level, a polemic of my assertion that a polemic. Okay, so big word means defense of my assertion that there really isn't the fall of man in the Book of Genesis, and I don't want to do that. I don't want to spend the time doing that. But what I do want to do is give you a flavor of these methods and these tools. But we've learned a lot. And frankly, once you start unpacking this, once you start looking into the details, you suddenly realize this is vast. And to give you some sense of how vast, I mentioned this book earlier. This is the Old Testament Survey. Remember I said it was Erdman's. I talked about Erdman's. And I said that the William Sanford, the LeSueur book. I couldn't remember the other authors, but it's David Allen Hubbard and Frederick William Bush. This was the book that was used for Old Testament survey and a number of my Old Testament classes when I was in college. It's old, well-loved, lots of notes. And I also, of course, I showed you some other books. Here they are, E.P. Sanders. And E.P. Sanders is prolific. I, on some level, I admire the man because this guy can crank out the stuff. And there's a lot of scholarship. And if this is the final form, imagine what's sitting in this guy's office. I only use this as a way to impress upon you that when you start doing exegetical research, the facets, the tributaries, the fingers of investigation go out in multiple tentacles. Which means there's no way for me to do any specific drill down, a huge amount of, an exhaustive justice, if you will. So I'm going to have to, I've curated this down to some it's pretty narrow. And I will appreciate the accusation later by those academic sorts that I really haven't exhausted some of the implications back or forth, to the left or the right of whatever point I've made. I get it. I understand. And that's probably my only caveat and addendum for this presentation. And here's the thing, I happen to like this stuff. This was where I got my degree. So wading through dusty books written by socially challenged academics is kind of my thing. But these are big subjects. Like I said, once you start digging into the exegetical background, once you try to start drawing out what has been learned, even that Old Testament survey book, it just represents a small overview of what's been learned about ancient culture, geography, politics, literature of all kinds, languages, and the subsequent, and the most important part, the subsequent theological implications of those facts. So my goal here is to give those high levels. I want you to hear what the original authors were trying to say. So let me briefly segue back into my comments about the fall of man. Trying to read the book of Genesis in an effort to disprove a prevailing doctrine, would mean I would still bring that frame of reference and try to superimpose it on that to then somehow extract it out. And that defeats the purpose of what I'm trying to do here. That would be almost exactly like reading the book of Genesis and trying to harmonize it with modern evolutionary scientific conclusions. By bringing evolution into the book of Genesis, you've superimposed a very 21st century, 19th, 20th century preoccupation onto a book that was written thousands of years ago, who I guarantee the original author had no concern with. And so it would introduce scientific requirements into a narrative that was originally written to an audience that was concerned with very different intellectual things, very different intellectual challenges. The real goal here is for me to inspire you to think new thoughts, to see a body of interpretive tools used and how that shifts and changes what you can actually get out of this literature. And I'm going to start with asking my fundamental questions. Who's writing? Who is the audience? What is the occasion? And finally, I'm going to demonstrate how to think in whole paragraphs. And I tell you, that becomes its own body of challenge because, well, you'll see. I'll show you. And then lastly, I'm going to check those conclusions with the exegetical litmus test. It can't mean what it was never intended to mean. If you see me read 6 words and go, oh yeah, by the way, that means John Immel should rule the world, you should probably know that isn't the right interpretation. So I will say this. This is a guy that I read a very long time ago. I read this in college. Conrad Heyer's The Meaning of Creation. Probably one of my all-time favorite books. No, not my all-time favorite book. I mean, I've got some fiction out there that I kind of like, but as far as someone demonstrating the methodologies that I'm talking about, I honestly think this is second to none. Of course, his preoccupation, he is trying to solve the problem of trying to read the book of Genesis to answer evolution. And on some level to address a very bad interpretive methodology called literalism, and that is taking effectively 20th century, 21st century English, the translation that is of the anthology that we call the Bible, and then say, hey, it literally says this right here, literalism, 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 and then pretending that that's the only way, and then discounting any other insight, any other piece of information, any other fact that is somehow extra biblical, and then just condemning people because they aren't literalists. Literalism is its own soup of disastrous theological effort, but whatever, it's out there. And so his goal is to challenge that methodology and then read Genesis from the perspective of the people that wrote it and the people that heard it. I'm going to rely heavily on his scholarship. I'm just not up to speed with chasing down all the caveats and addendums. I actually, believe it or not, interesting side note because I think it's relevant, I was so impressed with this and I started the Genesis. I think Genesis is pivotal. I think understanding Genesis, particularly in light of what I'm going to talk about, dramatically shifts a lot of the subsequent doctrinal development. So I actually reached out. Where did he teach? Gustavus Adolphus College in Minnesota. That's where he taught. So in 2008, 9, 10, I reached out to the college and to see if he was still there. No, he had long since retired. He was in his 70s. And if anybody knows this guy, I was really interested in trying to get a hold of his work, like the background work that is the basis of this. And trust me, if it's this big, what's in his office is volumes of information. And I was really trying to track down that content. So if you know Conrad Heyer's, and he's got all that stuff packed away in boxes somewhere that somebody's like, oh my God, what am I going to do with this? Please tell them about me and tell them I will take it. So anyway, I did do that. But anyway, I guess he had retired to Florida and I never got any call back. They probably just thought I was some crack with, I'm leaving messages on phone numbers. They were very kind to the college. I'm like, would you be willing to give me this phone number? And they did. They gave me contact information, but, didn't work out. Genesis. So who's writing? Who is the audience? What is the occasion? Great questions, and not at all easy to answer. Because Genesis, particularly the first 11 chapters, potentially spans millennia. Well, the story spans millennia. When the writing was done, again, not sure. Which means so the fact that it spans millennia And a good portion of that time frame is discussing basically primordial history. We don't really have sources. Plus, the bulk of Genesis deals with the primary character Moses and the initialization of his new religion. Now, when I say that, of course, we have the book and we read the last chapter, and so we know all the primary characters. We know the good guys, we know the bad guys, we know the guys in the black hats and the guys in the white hats, and so we think it's obvious. Moses shows up talking about this God that talked to this guy by the name of Abram, who became Abraham, who wandered around in the middle of nowhere and then became rich beyond pretty much anybody's wildest imagination. And it seemed like that the only purpose that this God had was to make his people breed like rabbits. When Moses shows up and goes up to the Egyptian Pharaoh and says, "Hey, let my people go," that would have been beyond a culture shock. It's no wonder that Pharaoh reacted the way he did. Who are you? And the only reason the subsequent pharaohs got fussed is because they were outbreeding Egyptians by the pound. So it was a new religion. And with the standard literalist interpretive methodology, and if you assume standard days and standard weeks and standard genealogies, it appears to make dating pretty straightforward, which places Moses, of course, at the time of Egypt. And because Moses is such a dominant figure, it's very common to attribute the whole of Genesis, plus a whole bunch else, to Moses as the author of the narratives. But scholarship has strong reason to believe that Genesis was written by a later generation of priests, as they compiled oral traditions during the time of the Babylonian exile. This places the writing in about the 6th century BC, to help you understand just a couple of generations past Solomon, David and Solomon. This means that the audience was reasonably sophisticated in understanding Moses' religion because they would have lived it. They would have been living it for generations. And they were living as outcasts as outcasts and as prisoners in a foreign, very polytheistic empire. The Babylonian worldview was a very robust polytheistic universe. And their subsequent military might and wealth, it would have been an enormous temptation to believe that the gods supporting the Babylonian Empire were the right ones, because it was so rich and so powerful. Now, to give you some geopolitical frame of reference here, you should see right there a map of Mesopotamia to help you orient. Now, there's no pop quiz here, so it's not like you got to take notes, but I do want you to kind of see physically where all of this sits. The stories, the subsequent stories, don't really, whether we're talking about Abraham or Moses or any of the other major characters, most of everything that happens through the book of Genesis, certainly in the first 3 chapters, all tends to hang around here. And that's what we're going to talk about. So I want to talk to you about the polytheistic universe of the ancient world. So remember I said that man is hopelessly philosophical. He requires a way to organize his world into a cohesive structure. And that structure starts with the metaphysical, always. Now, it doesn't matter that you didn't start with the metaphysical, but you still have in your world, in your own worldview, you have a metaphysical structure. It just might not be explicit. And so it was with ancient cultures. Now, remember I told you in Western culture is the first place to have a genuine formal philosophical evolution from the metaphysical to the aesthetic. Ancient cultures organized the world in cosmologies because it was the easiest, it was what they saw. They looked at the cosmos, the grass under their feet, the wind that blew through the air, the stars, particularly the stars in the sky, the sun and the moon, and the planets above. And then they organized their place in that world. They saw what they saw, and they said, oh, the sun, moon, and stars, that's what rules me. The animals that I see, the air that I breathe, that's what rules me. Every place man looked, it was a god. If he walked on the ground, he was walking on a god. If he breathed the air, he was breathing a god. If he looked into the stars, he was looking at the transcendent gods. If he saw the river gave life, gave water. It let him live, so it was a god. The animals he hunted were gods he hunted. So man conceptualized himself within this cosmology. He conceptualized himself as a cog in the wheel, as subject to the stars and to the planets and to the air he breathed and the animals that roam the earth. Not because they were predators, but because everything was a god. So remember I told you that the last step on the philosophical progression is art. It's how man reflects back to himself his deepest values. Now think about Egyptian art. Think about Babylonian art, if you've seen any. Egyptian is probably much more, no matter when Genesis was specifically written, both the Egyptian culture and the Babylonian culture were fantastically polytheistic. Also very militarily robust and wealthy in terms of the ancient world. And in all instances, the artwork places man typically as wearing the accoutrements of animals. Why? Because it's reflecting back his deepest philosophical values. Now, they weren't animals that we would see as creatures to be husbanded or, taken care of. But they would have been reflections of the gods. And so man put on himself the attributes. He used those animals to acquire what he thought were the attributes to be desired, the divine. Now notice by contrast, in Western culture, in the Greco-Roman world and the evolution of philosophy, that by the time we get to Aristotle, the thinker is a potent work. The thinker is kind of my trademark on spiritual tyranny, because thinking is the antidote to despotism. The thinker is one of the first works of art that places man in a position that is uniquely human. It depicts man doing what he does best, thinking. This is an enormous contrast to the ancient cosmologies and the final philosophical achievement of recognizing man at his highest and at his best, and that is in the process of thinking. So now you can see that fundamental contrast. But before we can ever get to the thinker, we must have the book of Genesis. And now I'm going to talk to you about the polytheistic, now I'm going to talk to you about the monotheistic universe.